Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous.
Is Donald Trump a Russian asset? Do we have a Putin puppet in the White House? Is Donald Trump a real-life Manchurian candidate? The answer is yes to all three of these questions. Donald Trump is a Russian asset, and he is too dumb to know it. One major piece of evidence for the Russian manipulation and capture of Donald Trump is being overlooked. It's a piece of evidence that makes it almost certain that Donald Trump is, in fact, a Russian tool. But before we get to this damning evidence, let's go over a little bit of background. If you've tuned into the news this week, you've heard from the New York Times that the FBI was so shocked by President-elect Donald Trump's persistently pro-Russian behavior that it initiated a counterintelligence probe to see if Russia might be manipulating Donald Trump, and if so, how? If you've paid attention to this modest YouTube of mine, you've been told what a Russian dupe is and how Donald Trump fits the definition perfectly. Yes, a Russian dupe. You've also been told that the Russians don't need to have blackmail material in order to use Donald as a puppet. Why? Because Donald Trump feels that the global political arena is a playground for bullies, and he is a bully who desperately needs acceptance, the acceptance of other bullies. The bully Donald Trump sees as the dominant male in the global playground is Vladimir Putin. Trump was shocked when he won the election to the presidency. He felt like a political outsider. But to him, winning the election of 2016 was a chance to join the exclusive club he admired the most, the global gang of bullies. Who were those bullies? Xi Jinping of China, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, Bashar al-Assad of Syria, and the head bully, the leader of the pack, Vladimir Putin. Trump did everything possible to meet face-to-face with Putin, a man who had eluded him when he had thrown his Miss Universe pageant in Moscow in 2013, a man who had eluded him again when he'd enter into negotiations for a Trump World Tower in Moscow in 2015. Trump's whole heart and soul was wrapped up in meeting Putin and gaining his approval. Why? Because Putin's approval would have put Trump into one of the most exclusive gangs on the planet, the gang of Putinistas, mini-Putins, Putin lookalikes, Putin allies, and Putin imitators. Then there's the fact that two banks operating on behalf of Vladimir Putin had saved Donald Trump with huge loans when Trump was undergoing 6 bankruptcies and was threatened with destruction and humiliation in 2008. In other words, Trump has been on the Russian payroll for almost 11 years. But leaving the Russian money aside, what evidence is there that Donald Trump is acting as a Russian dupe, a Russian pawn, that Trump is operating as what Russian intelligence calls a useful idiot? The evidence is in a book, The Kremlin Playbook. On October 27, 2016, 10 days before the election of Donald Trump, the Council for Strategic and International Studies published that vital book, The Kremlin Playbook. Its subtitle is Understanding Russian Influence in Central and Eastern Europe, and the organization behind the book, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, is one of the top think tanks in Washington, D.C. The authors of the Kremlin Playbook studied the ways in which the Russians were installing useful idiots in power in Eastern European countries like Bulgaria and Hungary. Little did the authors realize that the same thing was about to take place in America. First off, says the Kremlin Playbook, Russia is using a new doctrine of warfare. Its chief proponent, General Valery Gerasimov, calls New Generation Warfare. Now, what's New Generation Warfare? Explains the Kremlin Playbook, it is, quote, primarily a strategy of influence, not of brute force, close quote. In other words, New Generation Warfare uses influence, not weaponry. How does it gain influence? It places its bets on young businessmen and politicians in the hope that the relationship it cultivates will pay off in time. To quote the Kremlin Playbook, quote, Russia has sought to maintain its influence by cultivating a network of power brokers who are capable of advocating on Russia's behalf. Who are these mouthpieces for the Kremlin in foreign lands? Says the Kremlin playbook, quote, wealthy and influential businessmen or former high-ranking public officials who are able to influence decision-making. The Kremlin playbook continues, typically Russia entices these individuals into its service by offering them lucrative business opportunities in which the Russian government is involved. Mark those key words. Russia cultivates wealthy and influential businessmen by offering them lucrative business opportunities in which the Russian government is involved. Trump World Tower Moscow would have brought as much as $330 million into Donald Trump's coffers and would have made him an honorary oligarch in the Russian sphere of influence. The infamous Steele dossier, compiled by a highly respected former British intelligence officer with contacts at the highest levels of Russia's internal workings, said in 2016 that, quote, the Russian regime has been cultivating, supporting, and assisting Donald Trump for at least 5 years, close quote. In other words, since the early planning stages of Trump's Miss Universe pageant in Moscow. Adds the Steele dossier, quote, the Trump operation was both supported and directed by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Yes, according to Steele's Russian sources, the capture and control of Donald Trump was directed by Vladimir Putin himself. Now look, the Russians cultivate thousands of influenceable souls around the planet in the hope that 2 or 3 will pay off. Now, did Putin's bet on Donald Trump pay off? You bet. The proof is in the biggest goal of Putin's influence warfare. That goal, says the Kremlin playbook, is to break, quote, the internal coherence of the enemy system, close quote. The ultimate goal of new generation warfare, says the Kremlin playbook, is, quote, the eventual collapse of NATO, the European Union, and the U.S. global leadership by actively discrediting the Western liberal democratic system, close quote. The Brexit movement in Britain, the movement currently tearing the United Kingdom apart, was one manifestation of the Kremlin's new generation warfare. Brexit is a demand that England pull out of the European Union. It is now the official policy in London. England will exit the European Union in March, and Brexit is doing its job. It is tearing England apart with the threat that Scotland and Ireland might pull out of the United Kingdom. What's more, it is a major blow to the European Union. But the real Russian tool for destroying NATO is not Brexit. It's Donald Trump. The Donald has insulted just about every NATO leader. He's demanded greater military expenditure from our allies, something that Barack Obama kicked off, but he's done it in a far more obnoxious manner. And more important, Trump has shown contempt for NATO. He's called it obsolete. Score one mighty victory for Vladimir Putin. Trump has allowed Putin to achieve in 2 short years what the Russian leader must have imagined would take over 20 years at least. Then there's one more tiny trick outlined in the Russian playbook. Says the Kremlin playbook, the Russians love to create paralysis. The paralysis of political systems. Why? Because in the view of Russian intelligence, paralysis generates support for alternative and more extreme political movements. And the more extreme the political movements, the more likely they are to create political tribalism and to tear a nation apart. The more likely they are to generate factions, and in places like Italy, entirely new political parties. Factions and political parties, some of which can be made pro-Russian. Parties that will want to bring their nations into Putin's sphere of influence. That will want to take their nations out of the Western alliance, as the Italian party, now running the government in Rome, wants to do. This love of paralysis would make Mitch McConnell a prime tool of the Russians, a totally unwitting tool. After all, McConnell stopped every Obama bill he could for close to 8 straight years. McConnell was a paralyzer. Now an even greater paralyzer is on the scene, Donald Trump. And the paralysis of the moment is the longest government shutdown in American history. So by leaking Hillary Clinton's emails, planting phony news on our internet, and even sponsoring political demonstrations on the American streets in which Russia sponsored both sides, Vladimir Putin has won a new generation warfare war, a war in which not a single shot was fired, and he's won that war by installing a man who worships him in the White House. Vladimir Putin has won a war of influence by puppeteering Donald Trump. This is Howard the Humongous, speaking to you from the future. It's your job and my job to make. Or, want to know why? Ask how. And now for that, oh my God, where the hell is it? Sleazy, slimy, sneaky, seditious little off button.